to give people more background in the key issues that people are raising that face the neighborhood today. So we had 2 previous sessions last year in November and December, and those sessions were about a 101 about affordable housing, and also about zoning and planning. And all the presentations, as well as the recordings of those sessions, are available on the project website. We are fortunate today to have several speakers who are at the forefront of this field in terms of transportation planning and complete streets. We have, if you see on your agenda, we have Jeff Tumlin, who is the Principal and Director of Strategy at Nelson Nygaard, a transportation consulting firm that's doing projects all over the country, all over the world, relating to this topic area. And we also have city staff. We have Eric Anderson, who's the Pedestrian and Bicycle Program Manager, Kamala Parks, who is the Associate Transportation Planner with the city. We also have Mariana Parreiras, who's with BART, right over here, who's the Access Coordinator, and Mika Miyasato, who's with AC Transit. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Tumlin, who's going to facilitate and moderate. He's going to give you a presentation, an overview about the basics of complete streets, and then moderate the panel in question and answer, where you'll have a chance as well to pose questions to the panelists. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. So once again, my name is Jeff Tumlin. I'm a transportation planner with Nelson Nygaard, based over in San Francisco. But I spend a lot of time in Adeline because I've got a number of friends who live over here. And thank you so much for coming out on this spectacularly beautiful Saturday morning to talk about streets. And that's what this presentation is really about. The focus of this workshop is mostly about sort of the functional, the mobility aspects of streets, but also to a certain degree the placemaking aspects of streets themselves. How do the sidewalks work? How do they contribute to a more convivial place to live and a better place to do business? So this morning's presentation is a little bit wonkish. It's about the things that make streets work and the things that make streets work not so well. And Adeline is a kind of mixed up place. The cross-section varies a lot. There are places where there's this giant median, there's portions of it that have incredibly complicated intersections. There's parts of it that are really quite lovely, and then there are parts of it that, as a pedestrian, that's one of the longest crosswalks I've ever visited anywhere in the Bay Area. It's a big, complicated place. And while you can think about changing things on one stretch of it, then you go 3 blocks later and the cross-section and the needs completely change. So Adeline is also a place where a one-size-fits-all solution is not going to work. We really need to think very carefully, block by block, about all of the mobility functions of the street and how those relate to making it a great place to be, to do business, to walk, to bike, to take the bus along. So there's a lot of good stuff has happened on Adeline over the last couple of years. There's some good attention that's been made to the landscaping. There's some corner extensions called bulb outs with some landscaping. There's been various efforts at inserting public art into the corridor. All of that is really good. There's been some efforts at activating some of the larger public areas in Adeline, but a lot of the space, a lot of the kind of public or green space in Adeline is the sort of thing that very few people actually use. A lot of that space is used only by, drivers looking at it as they drive past at 35 miles an hour. So one of the things we've wondered about is, can we make better use of this amazing right-of-way in a way that serves the community better and makes it a more successful place to do business? So one of the things that we're hoping all of you will think about is, what can we learn from other great streets, both here in Berkeley and in other cities around the world, that we can apply to Adeline? And later we're going to be doing a little bit of an exercise in the back of the room to help you kind of rearrange the pieces of Adeline in order to help better achieve your goals. So things like some of the parklet outdoor seating on North Shattuck that makes that portion of North Shattuck a little more active and helps the businesses there, makes it a more fun place. But more importantly, there are things that we've learned over the last couple of decades, experiments around the world that may have applicability here in Berkeley and Adeline. So what I'm going to go through is first a couple of principles of great street making. And those are based on, could one of you hold up the green book that's on the table? Yeah. The green book that Elisa is holding up there is called the NACTO Urban Street Design Guide. And that was produced by the National Association of City Transportation Officials, taking a very different approach to street design that is rooted in the notion that streets are not just for moving cars. They're not even just about for moving people. They're about creating great communities, supporting businesses, achieving their social equity, and ecological sustainability and other goals. So we're going to go through the principles from that book that I think apply very much to Adeline. We're going to talk a little bit about how we would know whether we've designed Adeline in order to meet community goals or not, specifically about performance metrics. How can we quantify whether Adeline is successful or not? And finally, we'll talk a little bit about everyone's favorite topic, parking. So these are 6 key principles that the NACTO guide is based upon. I'll go through each of them in order. First principle is that streets are public spaces. All of these street rights-of-way out here, they are publicly owned land. It is land owned by the people of the city of Berkeley, and it comprises about 25% of the entire city of Berkeley is street right-of-way. You, as the people of Berkeley, get to decide how to use this public resource. It is a capital public resource held in public trust by the city of Berkeley, right? And so how you decide how to use that land is up to you, but you need to decide how to, well, basically what your values are and how those values should be reflected in your street design guidelines, transportation performance metrics, and how you balance the many competing needs in allocating street space. Streets don't have to be just for cars. They serve a very important function of moving cars and buses and bikes around. But there are streets, this happens to be the 3rd Street in Santa Monica, and there aren't cars on 3rd Street in Santa Monica, and it's a thriving, vibrant place that is also incredibly successful for business. Which is the second key point, which is one of the really important functions of streets is to serve the businesses along those streets. Businesses absolutely depend upon access, particularly customer access, but also employee access. In fact, I would argue that one of the most fundamental reasons we have streets is to support business success, not only for the benefit of the business owner, but so that all of us can get the stuff that we need. Adeline is your neighborhood commercial street, right? For many of you who live in the neighborhood, many of the needs of daily life can be found on Adeline, which means you don't have to drive to Emeryville in order to get your groceries or your dry cleaning or whatever it is that you want to get done. Streets are really important for business, and there's a lot of tensions in how we think about how to design streets to support businesses. And I'll talk at the end of this presentation about some of the recent survey data that we've just collected over the last couple of weeks about how people are accessing businesses on Adeline. We've also found from data all over the world, this data happens to be from New York, but when we've collected such data in San Francisco or Des Moines or Dubuque, we see really interesting patterns of how changing the street environment impacts businesses. Many of those changes in counterintuitive ways. So in this example in New York, the city removed a traffic lane in order to put in a protected bike lane. And as happens everywhere, many of the merchants complain, you can't take away the traffic lane, congestion will be horrendous, I'll go out of business, the world will end, this will be awful. But the city collected very good data before the experiment was done. They did a 6-month pilot just to see what effect the change would have, and they continued to collect data during the pilot phase, and what did they find? Well, they found that, in fact, by removing the traffic lane, peak speeds decreased significantly, which resulted in a significant reduction in injury-related crashes. But more interestingly, not only were there fewer commercial vacancies, but the stores that had already been there experienced a significant uptick in sales. And they couldn't figure out why until they did a little bit more data. And one of the things that they found is that while many of the merchants believed that most of their customers were driving, in fact, that was not true. And when there was a big increase in bike ridership as a result of the protected bike lane, the merchants found, in fact, that it was a lot easier to stop and shop if you were on a bike than in a car, because you don't have to search for a parking space, right? So these sort of local convenience trips for a neighborhood kind of commercial street, biking can be really good for business if it is done right. The other thing that the New York surveyed is they simply asked people on the street. So, you know, you were here before, what did you think of it before? Do you like it better or worse now? What are the things you like better? And in fact, 74% of users simply liked the configuration better. And so this pilot was made permanent. Similarly, programs really all over the country where we survey what happens particularly for restaurants and bars. If you remove the parking in front of the restaurant and put in outdoor seating, that those restaurants and bars get a huge uptick in sales despite the loss of the parking. And interestingly, because of the social effect of having the street appear to be more lively because there are people sitting outside eating, the neighboring businesses that were not taking direct advantage of that outdoor seating also saw a slight uptick in sales as well. So one of the things that we find is that it's critically important to collect good data to see what the business impact of changes is, and to also be very sensitive to the fact that for a street like Adeline, a disproportionate number of the businesses along that street are owned by the person standing behind the cash register, who probably has her life savings invested in that store. Small merchants are extremely conservative by nature because a 10% loss in business can bankrupt them, right? So, these small businesses are living and dying on a 10% margin. So we need to be very sensitive to their needs, while at the same time, experimenting with better ways of making the street operate. Which is a third key lesson in the NACTO guide, is that streets are in fact really easy to change. We tend to go through these incredibly long, agonizing public processes, and then spend an immense amount of money pouring concrete in order to change streets around, when in fact there's a lot of piloting and experimentation that we can do that does not involve concrete moving. It can just be paint, or not even paint, but tape. And not even tape, but fire hoses laid out to estimate where the new curb might be. You don't need to plant trees, you can rent them from the nursery in giant pots, just to see how changing the street around might look and feel. It's really hard to imagine, particularly in a street as big as Adeline, what a radical reconfiguration of that street might look like without kind of experimenting with it. And some of these experiments, even more permanent ones, can still be very cheap and affordable. And changes to state environmental law make these sorts of experimentations a lot easier. So we would encourage you to think about, if you have an idea, but you're not sure whether it's going to work or not, or how to get the details just right, play around until it turns out to be just what you wanted. And many of the experiments like these that I've led, my initial assumptions were close, but not quite right, and it wasn't until we experimented and moved things around until we got them into exactly the right place that we knew the design was right. That if we'd gone straight from concept into construction, we wouldn't have done a good job. Very importantly, and a fundamental concept of good street design, is that we need to design our streets for safety. We as street designers determine the number of people who die on our facilities. We choose the death rate. according to our design parameters. And this is largely as a result of, of Newtonian mechanics. So force of impact in a crash varies by the mass of the objects involved times the square of their velocity. And it's the square of the velocity part of the equation that is the part to pay most attention to. So as speed increases, the force of impact increases multiplicatively. It's also important to realize that the human body has a very specific design tolerance. Our bodies are designed to be able to suffer a trip and fall at our peak sustained running speed of about 18 miles an hour. So if you're running from a saber-toothed tiger and you trip and fall, you're gonna be cut and bruised and you're gonna hurt, but you're not gonna be dead. Above 18 miles, unless the tiger eats you, right? So the above 18 miles an hour though, the damage to our body also increases multiplicatively as speed increases linearly. So while at 20 miles an hour and below, you're like you're going to be bruised, probably you're going to recover. Above 35 miles an hour, if you're hit at 35, you will be dead. So designing streets for the lower end of the speed scale creates fantastic positive health and safety outcomes. Speed is also a big factor in how we pay attention, right? So if we're driving down the road at 15 miles an hour, our peripheral vision kicks in, and we have reaction time, so that if a little girl kicks a ball into the street and she goes and chasing after it, right? First of all, you will see that. Secondly, there's enough time to move your foot from the gas to the brake and stop, and everything will be fine. But as speed increases, our focus increases as well. Our brains are actually designed to turn off our peripheral vision. And at highway speed, highways work because they are designed so that we only have to pay attention to basically the horizon line in front of us. But in urban streets, where there's chaos, where it's pedestrians and girls kicking balls out in the streets and things falling and people maneuvering into parking spaces, it's a chaotic environment that our brains are not capable of handling at high speed without our peripheral vision processing in play. So another thing that we find about streets is that we automatically adjust our behavior based upon the perception of safety. So it's very funny to me that when I get complaints about a street being dangerous, like, oh, somebody's got to fix that street, it's too dangerous out there. For the most part, any street that people are complaining about as dangerous, that's likely the safest street. Because when we perceive things to be dangerous, we actually pay closer attention and slow down. And in fact, the number one rule of safe urban street design is recognizing the complete contradiction between the perception of danger and the actuality of danger. That if we want to make our streets safer, we need to make them actually feel more dangerous, quite ironically, because it actually changes human behavior. It makes people pay attention. Driving is the most dangerous thing that likely any one of us in this room will ever do. And my profession has spent a lot of time creating the delusion of safety in this activity. 30,000 Americans die every year as a result of human error by motorists. 30,000 Americans every year. So thinking about design and details like lane width and the safety outcomes that they produce is also really important. As lane widths widen, the safety outcomes get worse because the perception of safety improves. It's a sort of Alice in Wonderland world that we work in. So even modest reductions in speed produce a significant positive safety outcome. A fifth key principle is to also recognize that if our streets are about 25% of the total land area in the city, they're also a critical part of the city's ecosystem. Both good and bad. The bad part is that paved area right there is creating a lot of runoff that is both making it very difficult for the groundwater to replenish itself, but it's also taking all of the nasty stuff that comes off of our cars and dumping it straight into our creeks and straight into the bay, into some of the most ecologically sensitive environments. And so thinking through the entire water cycle and designing our streets for greater absorption into the groundwater, but also making sure that runoff isn't going straight into our most sensitive ecosystems, but is allowed to pass through gravel filters or dirt filters or sand filters or rain gardens in order to take those organic chemicals and allow bacteria to break them down before they make their way into our waterways. So lots of different interesting techniques, particularly for a street as wide as Adeline, that can have a significant improvement in water quality, as well as reduce the chance of urban flooding. Because the other thing that streets do is they just send all the water running off at once. And so for those of you in low-lying areas who've experienced flooding here in Berkeley, rethinking our streets can help prevent that. And the final point in the NACTO guide is the necessity for acting now. We've got enough information to rethink streets, and there's no point any longer in delaying. There's plenty of data about the relationship between good street design and safety, social equity, public health, business success, community quality of life. So one of the reasons why I'm so glad that all of you turned up here today on this beautiful Saturday is because we're going to be relying upon you to help make sure that the changes that the community wants will actually happen. So let's talk a little bit now about performance metrics. This is an important part of the conversation. So historically in my industry, we use one performance metric for measuring the success of everything that we're asking of the transportation system. And that is level of service, typically measured at an intersection level. How many of you have heard of intersection level of service, or LOS? Okay, about half of you. So level of service, or LOS, is an A through F letter grade system. And what it measures is the seconds of delay that a motor vehicle experiences at an intersection as a result of congestion in the peak 1 hour of the day as measured off of the peak 15 minutes of the day. So level of service, it's a calculation of the seconds of congestion-related delay that vehicles experience at an intersection in the peak of the peak period. So it's very wonkish, but this is the primary measure of success for everything in the transportation system. And it's a quite useful metric. So if I need to figure out how to optimize signal timing or decide when to add a left turn pocket to an intersection, level service is a great metric. But it has some downsides. What it suggests, because of the A through F letter grade system, is that a street that is empty and deserted and where the stores are boarded up, that's level service A. That's the best that we can do. Good job, traffic engineers. Fantastic. And then the worst that we can do is level service F. So this is a different University Avenue. This is University Avenue in Palo Alto, which used to have 4 traffic lanes on it. It now only has 2. University Avenue is at level service F, not just in the peak 15 minutes. It's at level service F for about 12 hours of the day. And the city of Palo Alto could widen University Avenue back out to 4 lanes. But they recognize that this condition is actually the ideal condition to meet their goals. At level service F, Palo Alto has created the most successful commercial street, arguably in California. This is, oftentimes the highest grossing retail street in the state on a per square foot basis. And it works in part because those cars are going really slow. It's almost impossible to kill a pedestrian. It's really lovely to walk down University Avenue because you'll walk faster than the cars are driving. It's a great street. And from Palo Alto's perspective, what mattered on University Avenue was not seconds of delay for cars in the peak period, but comfort for pedestrians. Retail sales per square foot feet for the businesses, the percent tree canopy, pedestrian safety, pedestrian volumes. Those were performance measures that city really cared about. Similarly, there are other downsides to overuse of level service, in that in a level service equation, if you are a passenger on a 40-passenger bus, you are valued at 1/40th the value of somebody driving alone in a car. If you are a pedestrian, it's not that you don't exist, it's that you're in the way of the free flow of cars. So under level of service, it's always good to eliminate a crosswalk, right? Because a pedestrian is merely an obstacle to the free flow of cars. So important things to think about, and to think about using level service in a more sophisticated way, and thinking about how its use varies according to your perspective. So if a traffic engineer says University Avenue in Palo Alto is a complete failure and empty street in nameless Bay Area city is our ideal, an economist would see the exact opposite. In fact, an economist would say that if the street is congested in the peak 1 hour of the day, all that means is that the demand for that street equals its supply at the peak of the peak. And that in fact, that street is perfectly sized, right? From an economist's perspective, level service F simply means that supply and demand equal each other at peak. Perfect. It's perfect balance. In fact, an economist would say that congestion is in fact not an infrastructure problem, but rather an economic problem. And congestion is what happens when supply and demand come into balance. And in fact, in an urban system like this, congestion is never the variable. It is always the constant. In any economically successful place, congestion happens when the economy rises to the point where supply and demand balance themselves in the mobility system. And the only question is not whether congestion will occur, but where it will occur. And that the best thing that we can do is to decide where to locate our congestion so that it has the least negative impact on our residential neighborhoods and commercial streets. That we need to, it's something that we need to meter. So, what are other approaches to transportation performance metrics beyond level of service? I think it's important to recognize that transportation is not an end in itself. There's no inherent public good in mobility alone. Mobility is an investment strategy. It's not an independent goal. It's an investment strategy that helps you achieve other larger goals. And so, one of the things I want all of you to think about is how would you know if we had achieved a successful Adeline Street? And not just from a mobility perspective, but from an economic development perspective. What's the level of economic development? How would you define a successful Adeline? Is it about the percentage of the stores that are locally owned? Is it sales tax dollars per square foot? Is it the fact that your needs of daily life are being met? Is it the mix of uses? How would we measure a successful economic development strategy for Adeline? How would we measure the quality of life, both for the neighborhood as well as your experience walking or biking or driving on Adeline? Can we quantify quality of life? Is it about neighborhood cut-through traffic? Is it about tree canopy? Is it about personal security, like feeling safe? How can we measure that? And there are very subjective measurements that we can still quantify simply by asking people. So personal security is in fact not something that you can measure after the fact. It's unrelated to actual crime statistics, but incredibly important about whether people feel safe. And we can quantify whether people feel safe by asking them. Should we be doing regular perception surveys? Similarly, from a social equity perspective, who is Adeline serving? If we change the street, who benefits and who suffers disbenefit? Do we want to parse social equity by ethnicity, by gender, by income, by whether somebody lives here or doesn't live here? What are the social equity considerations that we really care about, and how would we quantify those? And finally, on topics of ecological sustainability, what is it that we care about? Is it stormwater runoff? Is it CO2 emissions? Is it mode split? There are lots of different things that we can quantify, and what we want to know from all of you is what is most important, and how might we be able to find a number to do that. There are many other cities around the country that take these more sophisticated outcome-based approaches to making decisions about infrastructure investment. This is from Portland Metro that has, I don't know, there's like 40 or 60 or some odd, there's a very long list of transportation performance metrics that they use for making decisions about projects, including everything from the promotion of public health to natural resource disturbance, to very, very quantifiable and quantitative measures of economic efficiency and project efficiency. This then allows them to compare project alternatives against each other. One thing that I know for certain is there is no perfect design solution for Adeline. All of the design solutions that we will look at will have inherent and difficult trade-offs. There are many things that we're trying to achieve. Some of those goals are in alignment with each other. Many of them are in tension with one another. We'll talk about that in a second. So having performance measurements allow us to weigh different options against each other, recognizing that so the projects are in rows. Some of them are getting a lot of dark green squares, others are getting a lot of red squares. The darker the green, the better. But none of them is scoring perfectly across all of the criteria, and that is fine. Ultimately, deciding the right design configuration for Adeline will be a policy choice that your elected officials will need to make with your input. And it's going to be a lot easier for them to make those difficult choices if you can be clear about exactly how to quantify success. So finally, I want to talk about parking. Now, they're an important topic on any commercial street like Adeline. Parking is super important to commercial success for all of the small businesses in Adeline. While there is a very powerful local market of people shopping in Adeline that are walking or biking from the surrounding neighborhoods, there's also a lot of folks who drive to the Adeline Corridor in order to buy stuff. And once again, local merchants, many of them live or die on a 10% margin. So parking is important, but it's important also to recognize, one, that parking is very expensive to build, and two, too much parking can be worse than too little parking. Our challenge here is to find what's the right amount of parking and how best to manage that parking to make sure that customers who drive can always find a space, while at the same time recognizing that that parking is taking up space and requires a trade-off against other things that we might do with that space. More parking takes away space from wider sidewalks or from a protected bike facility or from extra stormwater runoff. So we need to figure out how do we shoehorn in parking and balance it against the other objectives of the street. Some things to think about are particularly about how to manage parking. One of the things that it's important to understand is there's actually remarkably little relationship between parking supply and parking availability. We don't need 100 spaces or 1,000 spaces or 2,500 spaces or any sort of fixed quantity of parking spaces on Adeline. We need to make sure, however, that both employees and customers can find a space near their destination when they need it. And so parking management and ensuring adequate parking availability at all times is really what the parking game is all about. So the first part of that is making sure that you've got a good parking management strategy that puts customers first. And oftentimes what this means is charging for parking. And the right price for parking is always the lowest price that achieves an availability target. The right price for parking is not the highest price, it is the lowest price that ensures 1 or 2 spaces are almost always available in every parking lot and along every curb face on every single block of the street. And this is critically important. If you or the city think that the role of charging for parking is to make money off of motorists, your parking management strategy will fail, right? The reason we charge for parking is to create availability. And what this means is that the right price of parking is going to vary a lot depending upon what block of Adeline you're on. It's going to be a lot more expensive on street than in a parking lot on the same street. People love parking on street. If you ask people to park in the basement, you knock 3/4 off the price of parking in order to get to that optimal lowest price that achieves the availability target. So the price needs to vary by location and also likely by time of day in order to ensure that motorists can always find a space. It's also important to separate the cost of parking from the cost of other things. If it costs me, $30,000 to $70,000 to build a single parking space, I need to charge at least $10 a day, every day, in order to have any hope of recovering that cost. And so if you're ever paying less than $10 a day to park, it's not that that parking is free and it's some windfall. It's that somebody else is paying for your parking for you, right? That cost is real, and if the motorists aren't paying for it, it's hidden someplace else. Oftentimes, the cost of parking is hidden into the cost of goods and services, or it's buried in rent for commercial space, or a greater concern for residential space. So one of the things that we always urge is that the price of parking be unbundled from both commercial and residential leases, so that somebody moving into the neighborhood doesn't need to have to spend more on housing to get parking that they don't need. And similarly, a household with several cars would have the ability to lease several parking spaces. So rather than having there be one parking space for every unit, take advantage of the fact that there is a broad diversity of demographics here in Berkeley, including a lot of households who would gladly trade giving up a car in exchange for a reduction in rent and the ability to live in a transit-rich corridor where the needs of daily life can be met on this very street. When we think about a street like Adeline as well, we also want to make sure that parking is seen as a shared resource rather than having there be individual parking supplies for individual businesses. So imagine if that were Adeline, but it's really, San Pablo up in North El Cerrito, where you've got the giant arterial and you have different land uses, and every land use has its own parking lot. This is how suburban areas are zoned. And the assumption is that, your daily life, you drive your daughter to school and that requires a parking space to drop her off, and then you go to work and you park, and then you've got to go take your daughter to soccer practice because she can't get across the horrible arterial. And then you drive and you get some shopping, and then you pick your daughter up and off you go. And while this is, it's cartoonish and very compressed, this is how most people live in the suburbs. And not only is that an awful lot of driving and traffic, it's also a lot of turning movements off of that big arterial, which is forcing the giant double left turn lanes and awfulness that we see when we go out to the exits. Now, how Adeline works is very different, where you've got the same big arterial. Your arterial is actually wider than most of those hideous suburban, exurban arterials that we see. But you've got a grid of streets, and you have your land uses that actually face directly onto Adeline itself, with a limited amount of on-street parking and a limited amount of shared parking facilities, tucked around. So as a result of that, you can make the same trip. You can drive and you can park, and your daughter can get herself to school while you go to work, and she can, walk across the street to the park to do soccer, and you can pick up shopping on your lunch break down the street on Adeline, and you can meet at the car and you can go home. Now, this is the exact same trip as the previous one. This is not a transit trip. They're not getting here by BART. It's still a drive trip. But the fact that you've arranged Adeline in this way that both accommodates the car, but makes sure that you can park once and do several different things, it has a profound impact on travel behavior. It means that you're getting all of this activity in half the land area, or twice as much economic development output per acre as in the suburban model. You got half the parking because that parking is shared. You've got a quarter of the arterial trips, a sixth of the arterial turning movements, and less than a quarter of the vehicle miles traveled, just by thinking about parking in a more sophisticated way. So we want to make sure that we're building on the success of your current model in Adeline, rather than imitating some of the more failed models out in the outer suburbs. So over the last couple of weeks, we've been collecting some interesting survey data some of it pertaining to parking, all of it quite interesting. And we actually just got some of the process data just yesterday, so I'm not going to be able to show you the whole thing, but the future survey data will be available shortly. The results, though, were really, really interesting. So, as in just about every corridor like this, we went and asked the merchants, how do your customers get here, and how do your employees get here? And the merchants, almost without exception, said overwhelmingly, oh, everyone drives, right? All of my customers drive, all my employees, get to work here by driving. And this is a sort of typical finding when we ask people their perceptions, particularly merchants. And this is largely because of the way, again, the human brain works. Oftentimes the worst experience in a corridor like this is from the motorist perspective, and bad experiences we complain about. And the brain records bad experiences in a very different way than it records good experiences. Bad experiences stick in our memory and color our perception. So after we asked merchants what they thought folks did, we then actually went out and surveyed real live shoppers on the street and asked them about their experiences, their spending habits, and how they traveled, how often they visited the corridor. And just as we expected, and is true in almost every street like this that we go and look at, the majority of shoppers and employees said that, oh no, we don't, why would I drive here? There's a BART station and 3 AC transit lines, and it's a great place to walk. So we'll be building upon this base of data, including the relationship between the travel patterns and spending patterns. Because another thing that was interesting in the survey results as well was that motorists spent more per trip, but they came to Adeline far less frequently. The folks who were walking and biking and taking AC transit shop on the street all of the time. So the total spending was much greater, even though it was less per trip. People are buying, a few groceries and then, heading home, as many of you do, I'm sure. So that is my quick presentation. What we want to do next is to have some panel discussion with our guests from the city, from BART, and from AC Transit, both to take your questions about this presentation, but also to hear a little bit from our visitors from other agencies. And Lisa, did you have the questions and comments? Yeah. Yes, while we're doing that, let's take a couple of questions. Yes, ma'am.
If we want to send out this, what you just did, where do we go to get it?
Lisa, could you?
So as with the other 101 sessions, we will be posting a link to the recording as well as all the PowerPoint and materials on the project website. If you email me, my information, let's see, it should be on the flyer, and if you don't have it, I will have cards at the table. You can email me directly or call me, and I can arrange to have the material get to you. Oh,
Some people's printers don't always work.
yeah, no, if you contact me or we can arrange it, I can get you a copy. And my contact information is at the bottom of the comment form.
Yeah, I noticed that, and I said, you can put it on the agenda, because one of them in the comment board.
Sorry, that is a very good point. Usually we have it on the agenda, and it was our oversight not to put it on the agenda. So I will put cards at the front table.
Okay.
Apologies about that.
Do you want to answer questions?
Oh, yeah, we can, why don't you do that so I can give some information?
Okay, great. Okay. A couple more questions. Yes, ma'am.
I have a concern about whether we can trust the city to respect the community process, because, for instance, the city has done a number of things recently to undermine the community's process here, including the mayor declaring a change attempting to declare a change of zoning in the area, a member of that declaring that Adeline is the perfect place for a 6-story building before waiting for the completion of the community process. At the last transportation event like this, there was a declaration that transit hubs were going to be created where development was planned, i.e. where there's already a priority development area, rather than where there was development. There seems to be a lack of sensitivity to the capacity on BART and our general failure of the bus system here. And we just spent apparently $7.5 million on a new, very trashy looking centerpiece for downtown BART instead of addressing the bus system problem. So all of these things make me think that there are planners in the city on the left hand doing one thing, and then on the right hand there are those that are supposed to be dealing with community process and input, and they're not talking to each other at all.
About trusting the community process.
We're doing our best, as you know, to try to have as many opportunities for the community like this, and during the regular large workshops and surveys, and you know, I was going to show a slide a little later about other ways that we're coming out to the community to give feedback. In terms of some of the other comments that you had about, I believe comments about that are occurring related to the ZAB or the other discussions about citywide housing policy. The ZAB question, you know, does come up related to, I think it was a particular preview for a particular development application, a proposal that was coming up. So, you know, what I can say about that is that, you know, there's obviously multiple entities that make up the city, and there's obviously a multiplicity of commissions and boards that are dealing with other projects that are going on concurrently with this process. And so I can't speak to the exact comments in that, but we're trying to, through this process, get as much information as we can from all the feedback that we get to all our respective, you know, the departments that we're working with. I mean, the people here are just, you know, an example of how, you know, what close coordination is happening in terms of this long-range process. So I think that, you know, there's always going to be some disconnect between various bodies and various members of various bodies speaking on their own, and we're trying to do the best we can to get the information out.
Okay, let's get a couple more questions. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I think I'm kind of related but not related. The city is currently going through its transportation strategic planning process, and so this seems like this is like a delay, or that has gotten ahead of what's happening with this important corridor and the decisions that are going to be made, because the community has been asked to participate in an online survey for transportation priorities and that strategic planning process. But yet it does, I don't know how this is linking and marrying to that, and how the public process here is going to impact decisions made within that context as well. So could someone?
Yeah, so fortunately, yeah.
Thank you. So we don't have control of some of that timeline, mainly because the Alameda County Transportation Authority, with whom we get a lot of grant funding from, has their certain timeline. But luckily for us, the Adeline Corridor project was actually, like, we knew that it was coming up, so it was one of the things that we submitted as part of the countywide transportation plan, so that we will have access to funding opportunities in the future. So there is a link between it, between what's going on and what our vision was from the transportation division's perspective about Adeline Corridor and what's going on.
It seems like the plan's already been determined, is what I'm saying. I mean, it seems like the plan.
No, it's still in process, but again, we had to submit a vague idea about what those projects are going to be last summer, but it's nothing that's set in stone or anything that can't change in the future. It's just we had to get it in by a certain timeline, and so we made assumptions about how much it's going to cost, but it's as linked as it could possibly be in terms of what we knew back then.
Okay, I want to just take a couple more questions, because it's very important for us to make sure that we get to the exercise in the back of the room, which is where we really, really want to get feedback from everyone here. And I want to make sure that we've got time for that. So in the back, yes, ma'am.
I thought your study was absolutely fascinating, and I was wondering if you did demographics when you interviewed people, and how the demographics of the people that were interviewed compares to the demographics of the neighborhood?
Yeah, we haven't, the results just came in, so I don't have the details on the demographics yet.
Did you do demographics?
We did some very basic demographics. We wanted to make sure that we kept the intercept survey short so that we can get a high response rate, which was critical to us. Yes, ma'am?
A comment and a question. One comment is just on the survey, we're not so much in an employee neighborhood. I'm a business owner, and just that whole employee question, like a lot of the business owners here don't have employees because they are the ones who are working, or they have independent contractors, and so I think that terminology needs to be updated, not just for our neighborhood, but for our society has changed. But just a question, I also found the data really fascinating. And going into this planning process, I have two warring things in my mind that I would love your help parsing. One is our neighborhood, our area is such an important corridor for shopping and doing great things from Oakland to Berkeley, right? So we're this really important corridor, transportation-wise. And then there are people who live here and work here and play here. And those two things, to me, seem very much at war. And what I hear you saying is we can mitigate them, but with a lot of hard choices? Or is it really bottom line, like it really is an either or, and we have previously been mostly paying attention to people going from this place to this place? Do you understand my question? Like, I don't want to sacrifice the rest of Berkeley or the rest of Oakland to make our place better, even though I'm a business owner here and I love this neighborhood. Like, I'm trying to understand that word in my own mind.
So I think you're identifying one of the key tensions, or a couple of the key tensions that we'll need to face. I think part of the strength of Adeline is that it serves many different markets, right? That's what, the fact that it's serving many different kinds of people is actually one of the things that makes it more interesting for every individual kind of person, right? Because it's serving a through market as well as a local market, because there's some institutions in the neighborhood that are taking advantage of the commercial aspect. Well, you can see some of the really interesting data about usage of the BART station that BART has the boards in the back. Yes, all. The question is, how do we best balance? So I look at the right solution for Adeline not as an either or, but basically like a sound engineer working a sound bar, right? We've got a whole panel of levers and dials. And the challenge is, how do we get each of those just right so that the sound is the richest sound that we can put together? And that is ultimately going to be a judgment call, and that's why I really want support from all of you in the exercises that we're going to do later this morning. Let me take one more question, then I want to move to the panel. Yes, ma'am.
I live off of South Shattuck, and I noticed that our name never gets mentioned in this process, and it's really important to me that that also be included, and these are really a holistic planning. So I'm curious, my question is, did this data include South Shattuck neighbors and also merchants? And then my second question has to do with open space. We are currently deficient in open space between White and Ward Street, and I'm afraid that we're going to front load development and back load community benefits, and if that's not in the zoning, we have half the open space allocation here that downtown developments are required, and we have less open space publicly accessible. I want to make sure that we can prioritize that, and that this actually ends up in our zoning code, because this is not a market-based process. If we will not get our social goals, our environmental goals, and our economic goals if the community isn't given more power over this than market rate development is.
So in terms of the data, our focus was on actually intercepting people on Adeline itself. So
It's in South Shattuck.
oh, it's outside, yeah.
Yeah, the entire plan area.
Because I hear that very seldom, so my neighborhood is very skeptical about our ability to meaningfully influence this process going forward.
Yeah, my apologies on that.
That's fine, I just want to make sure.
And then another, on the open space question, one of the really interesting challenges with particularly the middle stretch of Adeline, where the right-of-way is 180 feet wide, what do we do with all that space? And how, if a part of the street is going to be open space, how do we make that open space that will actually feel a part of the community, that will get used and be valued, as opposed to being like a highway median, right? So a particularly interesting design challenge for the street portion of it. Also an interesting opportunity, as I'm focused just on what's happening between the buildings in the street, but as you think about the land uses along the street, also really important, and is a trade-off against the economic development potential as well, because if you want to spin off more value for being able to secure and develop and maintain really high quality public open space, where is that money coming from, right? So it's an interesting trade-off. Too much development would be bad. What's the right amount that's going to give us the right set of community benefits? Okay, so I want to make sure we have time for panel, and then it's critically important that we hear from every single one of you in the room at the exercises in the back, which I'll describe in a second. In the meantime, I had some questions for our esteemed guests. So we're trying to coordinate this effort with lots of other things that are going on. As many of you have noticed, there's a lot of simultaneous planning efforts, both within the city and between the city and other agencies. And we're wanting to make sure that these efforts are being coordinated, which is why we have folks both from the city, Eric and Kamala from the city, Mika from AC Transit, and Mariana from BART. So we have some questions for you all. Why don't we start? Okay. All right. Actually, Mika, why don't we start with AC Transit? Can you describe, just briefly, the efforts that you guys have going on?
Okay, so some of you may have participated in past major corridor workshop, but I will just give you a brief update, a brief description of what it is in case you have not heard about it. So AC Transit has been conducting major corridor study since the late 2014. This is a study we're looking at high ridership corridor within our entire district and what kind of infrastructure investment we would need through the year 2040. It's a long range of planning, and we're looking at the future household densities, right-of-way width availability, and what's the likely scenario, how would bus operate, in 25 years from now. So within this study, that we include the outline, shut-up and outline, as well as MLK is a part of our major corridors. So we're looking at those are all important streets for us, about 100 miles of our district. So we're looking at 3 bus investment strategy, enhanced bus strategy like line 51, what kind of signal improvements or the loading and unloading of buses happen, and also rapid bus type of investment like the Telegraph Avenue and San Pablo Avenue. And ultimate, biggest strategy is the bus rapid transit that's happening currently under construction on the International and East 14th. So we're looking at district-wide what kind of improvements are right on each of the 11 corridors. And another things we have done is a transit market analysis, and we have found that downtown Berkeley to Emeryville is a significant transit market currently and also especially in the future. And in 2040 context, downtown Berkeley to downtown Oakland is probably the single largest market we would have in the AC Transit District. So outline corridor sits between Berkeley to Emeryville, Berkeley to Oakland market. So we'd like to continue evaluating and then see what are the right type of investment in this corridor.
And Mika, from your perspective, what are the sorts of improvements on Adeline?
From your perspective, what are the sorts of improvements on Adeline that would make the biggest difference for AC Transit passengers?
One of the things we have done is the passenger survey, and we have done this at fall of last year. So we have asked the passengers what are the important transit elements and what are you satisfied and not satisfied. So we're trying to find out what riders are satisfied, what riders are not satisfied, and important elements. So through this survey, the riders have told us what's most important to them and not satisfied is the reliability of transit and the frequency of service. So those are the 2 elements, and also we have heard clear and loud that people are not happy with next bus service, bus arrival prediction system, We've heard it's not available in most locations and it's not accurate when it's available. So those are the 3 items we have heard from passengers. So what are they happy with? Those are very few. The interesting also point out that we have heard the passengers are incredibly not happy with the lack of amenities. But when we ask like, what is more important, the service availability or reliability or amenities, that they have consistently chosen that reliability is more important than the bus benches and shelters.
So while we're on transit, Mariana, I noticed at the back of the room you have some boards with amazingly rich data about Ashby Station. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the interesting conclusions from that data and how BART sees the Adeline and South Shattuck corridors in relationship to your goals and the goals of your passengers?
I'm going to stand up. So the data that we have in the back is the result of a really significant effort that BART undertakes every so many years in the system. It's called the Station Profile Survey. The most recent data before the current data was from 2008. So for a long time, we didn't have very current data. But we have actually just recently completed the new round. And so we have brand new data from 2015. And we collect a lot of data points, enough that we have statistically significant data at the station level. So we learn a lot about our BART riders and everything about them at the station level. And so Ashby, in my mind, is actually one of the most unique and special stations in the system. And that's not just because it's my station, because I live nearby, but because of the characteristics of the station itself. And so, for example, we know now that 59% of the people who come to Ashby from their homes are actually walking to Ashby. And that number is significant, not just because it's large, but because it has increased over the 2008 data. It used to be 57%, now it's 59%, but if you consider the fact that our ridership has increased tremendously over that same period, then you can imagine that we have a whole lot more people walking to Ashby than we used to have 7 years ago. And that, despite the fact that there hasn't been a tremendous amount of development in the area. So we really have seen people shift from other ways and just walking wheelchair just grow. So what does that mean for Adeline? Adeline, in my mind, currently is a real barrier to walking to Ashby because it's such a dangerous and fast corridor. And so we would love nothing more than to see Adeline change and become more friendly and less of a wall for people walking from that side of the street. And since we're on the subject, I'd really love to see MLK slow down and become more friendly and safer for pedestrians as well. Wow, MLK next. Yes.
I don't know if you're going to get to this. It's not necessarily AC Transit or BART question, but there is a lot of biking. And there are parts where there's a great bike lane, but you're sharing it with a car. I always feel safer as a biker when it's nice and painted green so cars cannot get angry at me for taking up their lane. I can be like, this is my lane. But also there's parts of the bike lane, particularly at Ashby and Adeline, where it disappears. And that can be really sketchy. So I'm wondering if there's a part where you will talk about bike transit.
That is the perfect segue. So she was planning it. So this is another one of the many tensions that we have to address. So the city of Berkeley has one of the more sophisticated complete streets policies around that says, the streets are for all different kinds of people, whether those people are driving a car, or riding in the bus, or riding a bike, or walking, or in a wheelchair, or riding a stroller. Streets are for everyone. And yet, when it comes to translating this lofty policy into actual paint and concrete, it gets a little challenging. So I don't know what, Eric and Kamala, which one of you would like to speak to? I think, and the question is, how do you really, what tools do you have to make these difficult choices? And what is the thinking about the city as it's updating its bike plan? on the roller bikes on a street like that one. And sounds right.
Sure, thank you. So just really quickly, the city does have a council-adopted complete streets policy, and it does emphasize all the different users of the roadway: walking, biking, riding transit, driving, and goods movement to support merchants. That's a really critical piece that we can't forget when we talk about complete streets. One of the kind of common, I think, mistakes people make about complete streets is the idea that somehow every street will serve every possible user. And that's not actually what we're talking about. When we say complete streets, we mean a complete network. So we want accessibility for all users along the network on one street or another. And a great example of that is our Bike Boulevard network, where we've identified bike priority streets, which are parallel to the major arterial streets, which in many cases are transit streets. So this is kind of how we think about our overall network. It's a layered network. Not every street will serve every mode equally. And that's kind of where the tough decisions and the trade-offs come in. So I wanted to say a little bit about the bike plan update that we're working on right now. So we've actually done quite a bit of public outreach for the bike plan update. It's been carefully coordinated with this Adeline Corridor project. We came and had a table at the pop-up event that was on Adeline, and we've also come to the farmers market on Adeline a couple of different times. And that's part of a comprehensive citywide public outreach process we've done for the bike plan update. One of my favorite pieces of this outreach has been a public survey that we did to really understand the market for bicycling in Berkeley. So think about it as kind of a customer survey where we're trying to understand what our customers need in order to serve their needs biking in Berkeley. And what we found is that 90% of Berkeley residents would consider biking if conditions were right. And what does it mean to have conditions be right? Well, most people said, I'm worried about sharing a travel lane or sharing a street or sharing space with cars. So that separation between cars and bikes was something that the respondents of the survey really called out as a critical concern. And I think that's exactly what your kind of question was getting to, is the idea of, how do we sort out the space, excuse me, in a way that can meet the needs that Berkeley, or our constituents here in Berkeley have identified. So in addition to that survey, we're also doing what's called a level of traffic stress analysis of the city, and it's kind of a fancy way of saying where are people comfortable biking in Berkeley right now, and where are they not comfortable biking in Berkeley, and then we can use that measure of comfort as a way to prioritize improvements around town. And so the last thing I'll say about the bike plan update is when we think about the Adeline Corridor, we're really trying to answer the question, are the current conditions enough, or do we need to do more? Is Milvia Street as a bike boulevard enough, or do we need to do more? And for me, that really comes down to a question of access to businesses. So how do we improve the bike infrastructure so that people who are biking to this area can bike to businesses, can get to where they need to shop, and can support local businesses on Adeline? So.
I would follow up on that. So specifically asked about going on Ashby and Adeline. And when you go south on Adeline, it's almost a suicide spot for a bicycle. And it actually isn't a trade-off, because it makes absolutely no sense from any perspective I can come up with. Because it ends.
Right, and I mean, I can tell you that from the public survey that we did, if we want to get that street to a level of comfort that 90% of Berkeley residents are comfortable with, we need physical separation between the place that people bike and the place that people drive.
Are you aware of the intersection?
Absolutely.
Because there's a turn.
Yep.
So if that, it just doesn't need to be blocked like that. There's no reason for it to be blocked.
So that's part of the activities that you're going to be doing today, is that this is a priority for you to have separated, protected bike facilities on Adeline that goes through the intersection, and that's part of what we're trying to do here today.
So we're running a little behind, and I really want to make sure that we take best advantage of all of your time and get comments from all of you. So Thank you, panelists, for your comments. I'm going to move along. All of the panelists are going to be back at stations in the back of the room, so if you have detailed questions for them, please do take your questions then. What I want to do right now, though, is summarize next steps and then introduce the exercise that we're going to get a lot of comments from all of you. Elisa, did you want to summarize the process steps, and I'll talk about the exercise?
So as I mentioned earlier today, we are kicking off the second phase of this long-range planning process to work with you to develop a plan for the South Shattuck and Adeline Corridor. And the second phase is about taking all the input that we got for last year and working with our consultant team to develop that into questions and choices about different options about affordable housing, transportation options, economic development, open space options. And so the fact that there are so many different options, especially related to the roadway, there's a lot of moving pieces, it's very complicated. So this is right now this is what we have lined up in terms of upcoming chances for you to learn about the planning process and come talk to us. We're having mobile idea centers. We just we will be sending out an email soon with all these dates. But basically we'll be at Ed Roberts on May 4th. We'll be at the Malcolm X Elementary School Spring Fair. So you can come talk to us, ask questions, and we'll also be sharing more information as we develop it. And then there's going to be an Adeline Community Outreach Team meeting, an ACOT meeting. If you're not familiar with that, that is basically members of the community who have volunteered to put in a little extra time to help us with improving our outreach events and how we present information so that it is as clear as it can be. These are folks that have met several times. Last year, we're having another meeting to help us refine how we do the outreach, how we do the next community workshop. We have the next large community workshop right now scheduled for May 21st on Saturday, again here at the South Berkeley Senior Center. I will add the time to that. I believe that is starting at 9:30. It's going to be a long session. It might be a 3 or 4 hour workshop. We're trying to develop the, after we talk to the ACOT, we can kind of refine whether, what makes the most sense. So there are from time to time changes in the schedule that might occur from, we're always adding things, and so just bear with us. We always, if you are on email, I encourage you to sign up for the email list. If not, we always are posting flyers up and down businesses as well as at the senior centers. If there's another place where we should be flyering, let us know. Before the big workshops, we'll be doing postcards and door hangers. So if there's something that we've missed in terms of getting word out to you about the schedule, be sure to let me know, either during this meeting or calling me or emailing me. So with that, I think there's one more after that. My cards are up front, so again, you can call me, email me, and check the project website for information. And with that, we will go into the open house.
So now we move into the most important part of the morning, which is our open house. So as I already mentioned, folks from the city, from AC Transit, and from BART have stations in the back of the room. They'll be there. There's a lot of data about the BART station profile data for Ashby Station, all the stuff that AC Transit is planning, the other efforts underway by the city of Berkeley as they relate to these projects. So ask all of your detailed questions from our panelists there. But then the other thing that we're doing is a design your own Adeline and South Shattuck exercise. So as I mentioned, this project is all about balancing trade-offs. There is no perfect design solution. There are an almost infinite number of design solutions, and we're trying both to narrow options down, but also to have you help us explore different ways of rebalancing the street. So what there are is a bunch of 11 by 17 cross sections of the street as it is today. And there are, every 3 blocks of the street, the right-of-way changes dimension. So what works on one stretch might not work on the next stretch. You probably may have time to only pick one stretch of the street. So pick your favorite stretch, or if you're really ambitious, do all 3 and see the issues that we're struggling with about how to get them to connect to each other properly. In addition to these handy little sheets, can someone in the back hold up some of the little street elements? There we go. So we have little bike lanes and little travel lanes and little sidewalks and other little elements of the street that you can cut and paste and rearrange however you like. You'll have some technical experts if you need help on certain configurations. Some things have, basic dimensional parameters that are necessary in order for it to work from an engineering perspective. There are other issues like sidewalks that can be many different dimensions. And sidewalks are particularly challenging because you don't want sidewalks to be too wide or they will feel empty and deserted. So if you want a lot of space in the public realm, think about how that will be activated. And this is particularly important for that 180-foot wide middle stretch of our project area. What do we do with all that space? Think through the trade-offs between parking versus open space, parking versus a bike facility. Should there be a transit-only lane? Should the open space be in the middle? Should it be attached to one side? If there's a bike facility, should it be a standard bike lane or a protected bike facility? Should the bike lane go on the inside of the parked cars or on the outside of the parked cars? There are lots of different choices, and we really want to see your input. So there's a whole bunch of different sheets in the back. Feel free to work in small groups, work on your own. There should be plenty of scissors and tape and pens. The other thing that we would like you to do, in addition to taping things down as you like them, is to tell us why. What is it that you're trying to achieve with your cross-section? Is it that you're trying to preserve the way things are now because you like it? Or that you're trying to make things better for one user or another user? Let us know why you're making the choices. What will be really interesting to us is to see where there's convergence on an idea and where there's deep divergence, which is perfectly fine. There may be, half of you want it entirely this way and the other half want it a completely different way. That will help us as professionals figure out the next steps for resolving disagreement within the community and trying to come up with a street that works as good as possible for everyone, recognizing that in order for everyone to get everything that they need, no one can get everything that they want. Does that make sense? Yep. All right. One other thing.
One last thing to add in terms of this exercise is that it's just an exercise to get your feet wet. These are basic street design elements for a cross-section. We haven't even thrown an intersection, which is a whole additional level of complexity. This is really just to, if you haven't been thinking about this a ton, using what Jeff and the other panelists talk about to be able to start thinking about, at least allocating the space, in a width of a street, one section or one point in the street. We are not expecting, don't worry, this is not your one and only chance to talk about how you would like the street. This is purely to give you a chance to start thinking about it and give us a chance to see what's coming out and how that matches up with the input about goals and desires, the vision that came out from the last set of input that we have. So we'll come back to you with in terms of what potential options and the analysis on traffic. We'll have our transportation and traffic consultants to be able to look at, well, if you did these changes, it would result in this level of changes either to the traffic, to the pedestrian amenities, to the bike amenities. So you'll get a lot more information about what the impact or analysis of different choices that you make later in the process. This is right now to have a little fun and see what would you do. if right now, if you were thinking about the items that our panelists and Jeff talked about.
All right, ready to go?
It's fine.
All right, let's do it.
I don't.